We've been very patient with your time, and I thank you for your service, Director Mueller. Wish you the best.
Thank you. So I'm your last director.
Happily so, happily so.
Good to see you. Three topics I want to touch on. The first has to do with the investigation into the conduct of the IRS. The background to this is that the tax laws allow you to form up as a charity under Section 501c3, but if you want to lobby, you've got to form up under 501c4. And then, if you actually want to electioneer, you've got to form a so-called super PAC. The difference between a 501c4 and a super PAC, as you know, is that a super PAC is required to disclose its donors. So what developed was a pattern of folks filing as a 501c4, but then going out and electioneering as if they were a super PAC. And the problem with doing that is that there's a place on the form when you file for a 501c4 that requires you to assert and aver under oath that you will not seek to influence elections and so forth. So there appears to me, we had a hearing on this in the committee, to be almost a layup case for 18 U.S.C. 1001 false statement violations based on what appear on their surface. Again, this requires investigation before you can make any final determination, but it appears on the surface that these are flagrantly false statements made under oath to a government agency for the purpose of misrepresenting the intentions of those forming the 501c4. That never comes to the FBI because there's an agreement between the Department of Justice and the IRS that unless the IRS has put a case together and forwarded it, we're not going to look at it. And I think the 501c4 applicants were taking advantage of that, and the IRS was feeling a bit intimidated because there were some very powerful people in this country on both sides of the aisle behind the problem, behind the 501c4 problem. So I hope that as you're looking at the IRS question, part of what you're looking at is whether or not something that, as you and I both know, is really a plain vanilla prosecution, a false statement case, is something that the FBI should turn away from because the IRS has not yet referred it when it's kind of out in the plain light of day. And I hope that you will consider that question as the IRS investigation moves forward. It may not be the kind of question that leads to a charge. It may not be purely investigative, but I think it's an important policy question. And I think it's important for the American people to know that when people are doing something that appears on its face, again, subject to rigorous investigation and proof, but appears on its face to be a flagrant false statement, the answer from the government, yeah, but it wasn't referred to us in the right way, isn't a very convincing answer to what appears to be a fairly blatant criminal act. Not a very major one, but a very blatant one. So I'd like to ask your comment on that, if that's something that you will consider as part of your look at this.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any such agreement. I'll have to look at that and discuss and see what this
We'll make that a question for the record, and you can get back to me later. The second is we met recently with some of your folks, some of the Department of Justice folks, and the Office of Management and Budget to try to figure out how our prosecutorial and investigative law enforcement resources should be structured to focus on the cyber problem. And in the time that I've been in the Senate, 6 years now, I've watched that administrative structure morph really almost every year to something new, something different. And I've been out to NCI JTF and some of your facilities, and I applaud and am impressed by how hard the FBI works to keep track of who's coming in the doors and windows attacking our country and our companies, and trying to get those alerts out as quickly as they can to the companies that are being attacked and having their intellectual property stolen. But it hasn't resulted in a lot of prosecutions. And as best I know, there is not a single case that has ever been prosecuted of a pure industrial espionage, cybersecurity attack from outside the country on an American company. There's always been something involved, a CD that got stuck in somebody's pocket, but the pure hack, I'm not aware of a case that has been made yet, and that's a question I ask pretty frequently. I think this is a boom area. I'm delighted and pleased that the administration, in a time when most other parts of the government are being asked to cut, is actually investing more in cybersecurity at the FBI, at the Department of Justice, at the NSA, at the Department of Defense, and in other places, because it's a huge vulnerability, I believe. And I know you're on your way out, but I hope that one of your departing messages to the Bureau will be, we need to keep looking forward to see what our structure should be to take on this threat in the years ahead. I don't think we're there yet. I think we've made immense progress. I think we're in a state of constant flux as we try to adapt to the problem. But when you look at a problem that is described by very senior officials as us being on the losing end of the biggest transfer of wealth by illicit means in human history, basically because the Chinese are raiding our corporations and stealing our intellectual property in a nutshell, that's a pretty serious problem set, and it's only going to get worse because it has its transnational sabotage and its multinational criminal components as well. And I hope that you guys have an open mind and have somebody detailed to looking forward and saying, what does this look like down the road? How should this be structured so we're really after it? When we had the drug problem, we started a DEA to handle it. What is the structure that this should look like down the road? And I know it's such a mad scramble right now, and you're working so hard, and people are doing such a great job, it's hard to kind of pop your head up out of the day-to-day fight and plan ahead. But I think that would be a good legacy for you to leave, that was a look forward, and let's see what this thing should be like 5-10 years from now.
I venture to say anybody in the Bureau knows the focus has been over the last year on cyber in a variety of ways. And we have to put our own house in order first.
Yep.
And we are doing that. We're not there yet, but we have to adopt over the next several years an organization that lends itself to addressing itself with more specificity to particularized threats that have been prioritized, of which cyber will be a substantial one. We now have entities or counterintelligence in cyber because they're like that, and our organizational structure is morphed into a threat-based organizational structure as opposed to a program organizational structure. And we've got to continue to do that. One of the focal points outside the FBI, though, is the NCI-JTF. My firm belief that for us to be successful, we have to have people at the table right at the outset and determine whether it's national security or criminal or what have you, but you need all of the facts, all of the information on the table, regardless of the classification side, because there may be something up there that will help you on a criminal matter down below. But have everybody in the relevant players in the government working at the NCI-JTF or some comparable facility. And then lastly, with the private sector. Once we have our act together administratively, and have, my own belief is, generally co-location, with the exception of ANSA because of what they've got, but the rest of us to be relatively co-located. Then, in my mind, you need the partnerships in the private sector to come together and equip themselves to share information, and then set up conduits between the private sector and the federal government that will assure privacy, but also enable us to share information in ways that we have not been able or had to in the past. And so I think we're moving towards that structure, but we have a way to go. And I can tell you, with my successor, it'll be we'll have some discussions on this.
Good. The last point, we've addressed it a little bit, but I'd like to make the point that I do think that we overclassify. It's much easier to classify than it is to declassify. There are a whole variety of reasons why, some good and some not so good, for classifying programs and classifying materials. But it seems to me that a lot of the stuff that has been said about the NSA programs and about the FBI's support of them could easily have been said beforehand without compromising those programs in any significant respect, particularly the multiple checks and balances. The number of guards at the door to the vault before anybody can get any kind of information, both houses of Congress being briefed in on programs like this, inspectors general being independently accountable to review programs like these, the internal oversight of the executive branch apart from the independent inspectors general, and the rigor and frequency of the audit that is done for those programs. The fact that regular line United States District Court judges are brought in on detail to serve on the FISA court, and they have to, in various ways, sign off on these programs. You have as strong an array of protections under our system of separated government as one could possibly create, I believe. I don't know that a single stone has been left unturned in terms of putting eyeballs onto making sure that these programs were carefully used and never abused. So that kind of story, I think, is one that doesn't hurt us to get out first. Before this incident, people knew that there were ways in which we were protecting ourselves, and we could have said generally that, without getting into the details of any of these programs, when we look into programs that affected Americans' privacy, we go all in on making sure that there aren't shortcuts and making sure that only qualified people get it. And so I think the lesson from this going forward is that as much as there's a public interest in classification of a lot of this information, there's also a public interest in declassifying it. And in some cases, I would contend that declassification has exactly zero national security risk associated with it. It just kind of got swept up with a bunch of other stuff because the program is classified. And we depend on you to do this because senators aren't declassifiers. The only way that the Senate Intelligence Committee can declassify anything is so complicated that it's never been used in the history of the Senate Intelligence Committee. So I'd urge you to, I'm speaking through you now, I think, to a whole lot of other people as well, but I do think that a more persistent focus on what could be declassified and what would help for these foreseeable events of disclosure would be a good policy to pursue. Your thoughts? I
understand your sentiments. I do believe there's a price to be paid. We tend to think that people know and understand the Internet around the world. But you have persons who want to undertake terrorist attacks that don't have a full understanding of the Internet. And to the extent that you expose programs like this, we are educating them. We're educating them about how the Internet works actually worldwide. We are educating them as to what our capabilities are, and the brighter and the smarter of them will be educated and find other ways to communicate. And we will not pick up communication we want. Now, it's not to say that the scale shouldn't be on the other side. It is much easier to explain to the public when you don't have the restrictions, quite obviously, of classification. All I'm saying is I do think there's a price to be paid. Not always. There are occasions where we can declassify things, but I wouldn't underestimate. I would not underestimate the price to be paid by a substantial, let me just put a substantial disclosures.
Yes, I agree. I think we have to be very sensitive to that, and we have to be particularly sensitive to that when we're talking about the operating mechanics of a particular program. So when we're telling the American people, we're not going to raise the question of what we're doing, but we want you to know that when, as and if we do anything, here are the kind of procedures we use. You would never tell anybody about an ongoing investigation, but we tell everybody about the warrant requirement, about minimization, about the things that protect American security. And that process is also classified when it comes to these NSA programs.
Good point.
That's where I think we can make some ground.
Yep.
This is, I think, the end of your last appearance before this committee, so let me thank you very much. You have been a terrific director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Before that, you were a terrific member of the Department of Justice and a terrific United States attorney. You have made an awful lot of people proud, sir, and we are very glad to have had the chance to work with you.
Well, thank you for that, but it's men and women of the FBI that make the place run, as you and I both know, having been in comparable positions. But thank you.
Well said. Thank you.